Reuters did a recent news story documenting at least more than 20,000 appeals filed by immigrants in lawsuits contesting their detention and deportation. More than 400 U.S. District Court judges, including judges that have been appointed by Trump, have ruled against the Trump administration and for the immigrants over 4,400 times. What some of you may not know is that immigrants and exclusion and deportation proceedings, because they are on the civil side of law, not on the criminal side, because they are on the civil side of law, immigrants in immigration proceedings do not have the benefit of counsel paid for by the public. So if they have a lawyer, it is because they paid for it with their own money, or they were lucky enough to have a public interest group represent them pro bono. And so this is where our guest speaker comes in. He's argued major cases in immigration. I doubt they're taking much money from immigrants, like most of us, who cannot pay the exorbitant fees to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So with that, let me turn it over to our distinguished speaker, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Anderson, President Anderson and Professor Law. And Calvin, congratulations. I am really glad to hear that you want to pursue public interest law career. That's really my only goal here today, is to convince every student to pursue law school and then a public interest law career, because we need the help. We definitely do not take a cent from any of our clients. All the ACLU's money comes from private donations, sometimes big foundations, and sometimes in certain cases we can get the government to pay our fees, but we do not charge anybody. So needless to say, resources is always an issue, and maybe we can talk about that. Thank you so much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's really an honor. I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to meet Professor Konefsky. Everything I've read about him, including really fascinating stuff his family has sent me, letters from Gerald Gunther. Professor Gerald Gunther was a very, very famous constitutional law scholar to former Justice Ginsburg. He sounds like, and I know he was, an extraordinary man. His scholarship obviously leaves an enormous legacy, but I think, as others have commented here, maybe his bigger legacy is how many students he inspired to go on to be passionate advocates and scholars themselves, and that's a legacy to be proud of. So I am really flattered that I'm here to give this lecture. Let me start with something that maybe some of you didn't expect me to say, which is that, generally speaking, I think that immigration raises enormously complicated issues on which reasonable people can disagree, both on the legality of various provisions, the public policy rationales and benefits of certain provisions, maybe even the morality of certain provisions. And there are reasonable disagreements that have been had over the years about immigration policy. But what I think has been going on during both Trump 1 and Trump 2 is not in that spectrum of there can be reasonable disagreement. I think what we're seeing now is just outright unlawful actions, inhumane actions, and something that I'm hopeful that eventually a good portion of the American public will view that way, and that the courts will view that way. And so I want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing and my colleagues at the ACLU have been doing, and other advocates to deal with what the Trump administration has been doing, give you a little bit of a sense of the challenges and what's been happening behind the scenes. There's obviously a ton going on, right? And there's a ton of different policies, and I think maybe we'll talk about that later, that is one of the Trump administration strategies, is just to overwhelm us with a new policy every day. But let me start by focusing on one policy that was enacted back in March, and I think it is sort of exemplifies just what's going on now with the Trump administration and the rule of law, and illustrates various components of what we're facing. So this involves what's called the Alien Enemies Act. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's understandable. I didn't know what it was until this second campaign by President Trump. I mean, I had only vaguely heard about it. And then all of a sudden, President Trump is talking about it on the campaign trail. And what the Alien Enemies Act is a law passed in 1798. And it's a wartime law. And what it says is, if the United States is in a declared war with a foreign government, or a foreign government or nation has attempted to or is invading us or engaged in what's called a predatory incursion, the President of the United States has the authority from Congress to declare every national from that country a quote-unquote alien enemy, take their property, detain them, deport them, even if they're in this country lawfully. And why Congress did that in 1798 was very clear, and it was a very specific law, and it was designed for wartime. And not surprisingly, therefore, it's only been used 3 times in our country's history, during times when we're in major wars. The War of 1812, the British invaded the United States, World War I, and World War II. And the rationale is that if we're in a full-out war with another country, the president has to have the authority to say that people from that country can no longer live here or be detained. Now, obviously, it's been abused even during those periods, and we know about the Japanese internment, but that was the rationale, very limited, and when the United States was actually at war. And so every president, Democratic or Republican, has adhered to that, and that's why it's only been used 3 times in our country's history. Well, all of a sudden, during the campaign, President Trump started saying, well, even if we're not at war, I think there are immigrant gangs that should be deemed enemy aliens, and I should invoke this law, the Alien Enemies Act. And the gang he focused on was called Tren de Agua from Venezuela, TDA. And he said they've been causing a lot of havoc in the United States, and it's particularly in Colorado, and they've been committing crimes, and I'm going to use this law. So for the first 2 months, we didn't see it, but the minute he started talking about it on the campaign trail, the ACLU began digging into the law and doing enormous historical research, talking to as many people as we could to be ready for it. So it didn't come for the first 2 months. Then all of a sudden, we heard on March 11th, March 12th, March 13th, that Venezuelan men were being rounded up from all over the country and brought to a detention center in southern Texas. And at first we thought, well, we're going to have time because the law very clearly says if the president wants to invoke it, it has to be, quote unquote, a public proclamation. But when we started seeing these men rounded up and the administration not saying anything, we knew that something might be afoot, and we also began hearing rumors from the press. So we feared that he might invoke it, not give any time, and try and make all these men enemy aliens and remove them in the dead of night. And so we stayed up all night, the night of Friday, March 14th, and filed a case in the middle of the night in the district court, federal district court in DC. And the next morning, the emergency judge got in touch with us and said, I've seen your papers, I think we need a hearing on Monday. And we said, Your Honor, our understanding is that these men are already being brought to a plane, and by Monday it may be too late. Our understanding is that they're going to be sent to a notorious prison in El Salvador called Sacat. And then the government will argue that you have no authority to do anything once they're in Salvadoran hands. So the judge said, I understand that. Maybe we should have an emergency Saturday night hearing by Zoom. The government unbelievably said, well, that's premature to have the hearing right now. The ACLU is just guessing that we've invoked this proclamation, which was outrageous since it turns out the president had signed it in secret that Friday afternoon, the night we had sent it, the day we had filed the case. The judge said, no, I think, and I said, Your Honor, we really believe that people will be gone by Monday morning. To the judge's credit, he said, well, we're going to have this hearing, an emergency hearing, on Saturday night. We had the hearing, and the government again said, well, they don't even know that we've issued, they didn't know we issued the proclamation at the time they filed the lawsuit. But the judge said, well, they obviously were right, because then the president ultimately had to announce that he had signed it. But that was at Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. So he waited. Had we not got into court, the planes, might have already been gone. We get into court, and we said, Your Honor, we believe the planes are imminently about to take off. This was at 5 o'clock Saturday night. The government lawyer said, I don't know anything about that, which was absolutely outrageous. Either the administration had sent this lawyer into court, and he was a high-level lawyer, without any information on purpose, so he could say that, or he was outright lying. And just to skip ahead a second, there ultimately was a whistleblower who said he was outright lying, and he knew very well the planes were about to take off. The judge said, well, I'm going to have a recess. You go find out if the ACLU is correct that these planes are about to take off with these men. The lawyer unbelievably came back and said, I still don't have information from you, Your Honor. The judge said, well, in that case, I'm going to issue an order. Don't turn these men over to El Salvador so we can sort this out, especially because, especially because you have not shown who these men are. But, and I'm going to come back to that. So the judge issues this order at around 6:40 that night. The government lawyer says he understands it. We don't hear anything from the government. Finally, the next morning, we find out that the men have in fact been turned over to El Salvador, notwithstanding the judge's order. And the president of El Salvador, Bukele, tweeted, oops, too late, the courts got there too late. And Secretary Rubio actually liked the tweet. So just basically saying, we don't care about the federal courts. They subsequently said to the federal court, well, we thought, Your Honor, you didn't mean we couldn't turn them up to El Salvador if the planes were already out of U.S. airspace. Just a cockamamie understanding of the order. Obviously, what the judge was meaning was, don't turn them over to El Salvador because you yourself will argue I no longer have authority. The judge didn't care where in the airspace they were, but the government stuck to that and said, well, we didn't violate the order. We reasonably interpreted it to mean that because the planes got out of U.S. airspace in time, your order didn't apply. And it was just absolutely outrageous. And what then happened was it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, the men were already in El Salvador, about how the case should proceed. And the government argued that it could not be one case in D.C., a national case as we had brought, but had to be what's called habeas corpus actions in each place where the Venezuelan men were detained. But importantly, the court rejected the government's argument that the men were not entitled to due process because the government had taken the position that these men were not entitled to any due process, and I'll return to that. So that was a sort of half and half decision from the Supreme Court. But what it meant was that we then had to, for the next 3 months, figure out where all the men were detained. As soon as we heard that they may be removed, we had to stay up all night and file emergency habeas corpus petitions all over the country. Denver, Western Pennsylvania, 3 different areas of Texas, New York, Nevada. And so that became a race to the courthouse in all these districts. The government then, we got into all these courts in time. We then heard that there was yet another place they were bringing Venezuelan men, a detention center called Blue Bonnet, in a different district of Texas, about 5 hours from Dallas in a remote area. And we got a call from one of the local immigration lawyers who was representing one of the men, who said, the men are being given notices and they are being rounded up and they're supposedly going to be sent to this El Salvador prison again. Even though the government said they're entitled, the Supreme Court said they're entitled to due process. The men had been given no due process, meaning a chance to contest their removal. We went into court and we said, Your Honor, we need an emergency injunction to stop these removals. And what the government said was, well, the 2 people who were named in the case, we give Your Honor our assurances they will not be removed. But we said, Your Honor, our case is up on behalf of all the men in this detention center. The 2 people we named are what's called class representatives. And we're worried about all the men, not just these 2 men. And the government hasn't given assurances that all these men will not be removed. They've only given assurances that the 2 people we named. The court said, well, I think the government's assurances are enough. I'm not really worried about them removing all of these individuals. 3 hours later, now it's about 9 o'clock at night, we hear, again, this time from another immigration lawyer, who said they're giving people a notice saying you're going to be removed in about 12 hours and no chance to have a hearing or anything. And that triggered us going into action and trying to reach the judge, reach the government, and say, Your Honor, notwithstanding these assurances, apparently they're going to remove them by the morning. The judge did not act, refused to act quickly. We tried to go to the Court of Appeals, the next level up. The Court of Appeals didn't act in time. So we rushed to the U.S. Supreme Court at 6 o'clock at night, and this is all within a span of about 18 hours, and said to the Supreme Court, you said that they're entitled to due process, meaningful due process. The government is claiming now that they gave them due process because they gave them 12 hours notice with a form that explained nothing, much less the opportunity to get into court to challenge their removal. We waited all night. At this point, the buses are on the way to the airport. NBC is there filming the buses going to the airport. Finally, at 1 in the morning, I get a call from the U.S. Supreme Court saying the court has acted 7-2 and has said these men may not be removed. And so that was an extraordinary situation. But just to Professor Law's point about where the Supreme Court is, obviously you've all probably been reading that the Supreme Court has allowed the government to do a lot of stuff. In this case, they didn't allow it. And they ultimately issued an opinion that said, we said meaningful due process. 12 to 24 hours is hardly meaningful due process. And so those men are now still in the U.S. But what's come out of this whole thing are 3 sort of separate cases. The first is the government is still trying to use the Alien Enemies Act against the TDA gang. And so we are challenging its ability to use the law going forward. And we're making 2 arguments. One is the law can't be used during peacetime against a criminal organization, and TDA is not a foreign government or nation, and they're not invading the United States. And so the law is completely inapplicable. But the second thing we're saying is, even if you could use the law, the men are entitled to due process, meaning they need to be able to show that they're not even gang members, and that it's absolutely critical that they have that opportunity, because what we later learned is that the men were rounded up based on tattoos. And the tattoos, according to every expert on this Venezuelan gang, were meaningless. A good portion of them were just Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan tattoos. But not only did the experts explain that this gang doesn't use tattoos as an indicia of membership, but that the gang is fairly limited in the United States, doesn't have a formal membership process, and nothing the government said about these men suggests that they are gang members. And we finally began to talk to these men as we had more time, and it's clear that overwhelmingly they had no criminal conviction whatsoever, much less being gang members. And the government had simply sort of rounded them up because they were Venezuelan men and said, well, they have tattoos. So we're challenging this law, and we hope, and so far virtually every court has said you can't use this law during peacetime. And there's really an enormous amount at stake, because if the government can just say, we're going to use a wartime law and round up immigrants and send them to essentially a gulag in El Salvador, I think all bets are off for what the government can't do. But again, even if they could use the law, these men have to have due process. I think when they ultimately get to show who they are, I think the public will see that virtually none of them had ties to this gang. And in any event, that the gang was, we've always said if they're committing criminal acts, they can be prosecuted. And if they're committing criminal acts, they can be deported under the regular immigration laws. But the Trump administration's attempt to use a wartime authority for only the fourth time in our country's history outside of wartime has really far-reaching implications. So we're going to continue challenging that. We expect a decision from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which heard the case, the full court. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's what's called en banc. All 17 judges heard the argument at one time. We have a second case going to bring the men back who were handed over to El Salvador that night of March 15th. And it's now coming up on a year we've been trying to get them back, and the government has been fighting us at every step of the way. We've gotten an order to bring them back. The government appealed it. It's been sent back. We now have an order that we hope the government won't appeal to finally give these men a chance to challenge their removal or come back to the United States and do it, or challenge it remotely, but one way or the other to get the due process. And we think there's 137 men, roughly, who were sent out that Saturday night under the Alien Enemies Act. The third part of what's going on is contempt proceedings, because the judge, his name is Judge Boasberg, and he's been in the news a lot, has rightly been infuriated by the fact that the government disobeyed his order that night, that it was a clear-cut order and they simply disobeyed it. And so he has said, I want to get to the bottom of what's going on, especially given that there was a whistleblower in the Department of Justice who said, I knew full well we weren't supposed to turn over these men to El Salvador. It was clear, and government lawyers were lying to you. And so he has started what's called criminal contempt proceedings, where he wants to get to the bottom of who may have deliberately disobeyed his order, and if someone did, to refer them for prosecution. The government, not surprisingly, has fought him at every turn, and they've appealed every order he's given. It's back up on appeal. I think that the government may very well take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, because they know they can't let the evidence come out. I think if the evidence does come out, it will show that at the highest levels of our government, they deliberately violated a federal court order and sent these men to torture. Since then, we've seen lots of court orders violated in smaller ways, in smaller cases, but I think this was really the first of this situation. And you saw the Trump administration go ballistic, call for Judge Boasberg's impeachment. It forced Chief Justice Roberts to make a highly unusual public statement that we don't call for the impeachment of judges just because we disagree with their ruling. There was an enormous amount of trolling of the judge. His daughter was his daughter's picture was put in the newspaper all over. He received threats. And so we're going to see how all that plays out. But I think the case, not only on its own has really sweeping importance, but raises three issues that are now we're seeing constantly, and started, I think, from this case. One is, of course, the due process issue, which is the Trump administration is trying to eliminate due process for immigrants in any way they can so that they can detain as many immigrants as possible without due process, so they can deport as many immigrants as possible without due process. So they're going after people who have lived in this country a long time, who don't have any criminal convictions, have been paying taxes, and they're trying to detain them with no due process and saying, we're going to detain you mandatorily. And I think the hope is ultimately that these people just give up their claims or their right to live here and say, I can't take detention anymore, I'm going to leave. They were also trying to just shorten hearings or give people no hearing, virtually no hearing, even if they've lived in this country for a long time, and eliminate any due process to a right to a hearing. So we're seeing that over and over. The violation of court orders has now become commonplace. When we were dealing with Judge Boasberg that night, I think there was some hesitation for people to think, well, this is the start of just rampant disregard for the rule of law. But I think now people are, even people who are sort of middle of the road are recognizing that's the situation. A judge in Minnesota recently said that the government in 1 month had violated more than 70 orders, more, he thought, than some agencies in the lifetime of the agency would violate. And the Immigration Service had violated, DOJ on behalf of ICE had violated 70 orders in the 1 month just in Minnesota. So that's an enormous issue, confronting us all now. And the third part is what's called deference to the government, deference to the administration. Throughout, the jurisprudence of the United States for decades, centuries, there's been something called deference to the government, especially high-level officials in the national security area and in immigration. And what it basically says is the courts are not really competent to second-guess the administration. An executive branch official who has the facts and has to make those kind of sensitive determinations about foreign relations. And it's a difficult doctrine because it means the courts can't probe too deeply if something involves national security or foreign relations. But what's happened is we now don't trust the administration to put in accurate, truthful information or to be accurate in their claims that something implicates national security. And at first I think it was the advocates saying that, and the judges saying, well, we can't abandon all this, we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. But what we're seeing after that night in March and in subsequent cases is judges now becoming very wary of the administration's claims in court. And that is a dangerous thing. I mean, we are now in a situation where the rule of law is really being threatened. So as important as any of these individual issues are, the larger issue, I think, for American democracy is the rule of law being threatened? Are courts going to be listened to? Is the executive branch going to say, yes, we know the courts have authority, we need to tell them the truth, and we need to listen to what they do? If that breaks down, and it is breaking down, that is a very dangerous situation for our country. And so I think a lot is riding on how all the aspects of the alien enemies litigation plays out, but also how it plays out in lots of different cases. Are the courts going to be able to keep the administration in line? Is the administration going to start complying? And ultimately, where is the U.S. Supreme Court going to be on having the backs of these district court judges that are really struggling to figure out how do they deal with sort of a first time in history where they have the executive branch coming in and not necessarily being fully upfront with them. And, and even beyond just violating orders, the disdain this administration has shown for the courts is unbelievable. I don't think in, my 30 plus years doing this work, I've ever seen anything like it, where the lawyers are just outright being disrespectful directly in court to the judge, or in the filings they submit to the court, where there's just an outright disrespect, where they're essentially saying to the courts, mind your business. And that is very, very dangerous. And you see the district courts pushing back, not surprisingly, but ultimately I think it's going to be the U.S. Supreme Court that needs to put its foot down. And so we will see how all that plays out. And, and the due process issue obviously transcends the Alien Enemies Act. It goes to detention, it goes to deportation, it goes to whether people's green cards are going to be taken away, people's refugee status is going to be taken away. And I think the due process issue is one of those issues that is going to get traction, has gotten traction across the political and ideological spectrum. When these men got sent to El Salvador, for example, Joe Rogan came out and said, well, the administration's saying they're gang members, but how do we know? They never got a chance to defend themselves. That means anybody could be sent to El Salvador. It's not an answer to say, well, the administration thinks they're gang members. The whole point of due process is, of course, so that you go before someone neutral who can hear the facts. And so there are people talking about it. But let me switch gears for a second and move from the courts to sort of the public reaction. Because I think any civil rights lawyer will tell you that lasting systemic change can't come strictly through the courts, that it takes the public pushing back. And that's going to be absolutely critical, right? It was critical in the 60s with the civil rights movement, and it's, I think, critical now. And the way we've seen that play out, the way we've seen the public most energized, is when they can understand the human dimensions of the situation. They're, of course, sort of, you all, sort of as sophisticated listeners, can understand all the sort of more abstract doctrines, due process, rule of law. But ultimately, it's going to be the human dimension that moves people. And we saw that during the first Trump administration with family separation. Many of you probably remember that the first Trump administration started taking little children away from their parents at the border. At first, we thought it was a little issue. It turned out now, you brought this case, it turned out that roughly 6,000 children were taken away, some as young as 6 months. Many, many, many were just toddlers and babies. And what was interesting is when I first talked to the media about it, you'd think that even just saying that much would get their attention, but it didn't really galvanize anybody. But when we started finding the families and getting the individual facts out, that's when the media was galvanized, and that's when the public was galvanized. And the stories were indeed horrific. I mean, the sheer number of families tells one story, right? The aggregate number of 6,000 children. But it was the individual stories. One little boy was 4 years old, and he wore glasses, and his parents were from modest means, and they were able to buy him the pair of glasses, and in fact, buy him a glasses case as well, but they knew they wouldn't be able to afford another pair of glasses. When they came to take the little boy away, he's crying and screaming, please don't take me away, please don't take me away. They dragged him away. Fortunately, he was wearing his glasses, but they didn't let the mother get the glasses case. And so all day long, all the mother thought about is, can my little boy see? If he breaks his glasses, will they get him another pair? Will they show him where he can keep them at night? Another mother told us about an 18-month-old boy, her son, who they made strap the little boy into the back seat of an ICE car. And the little boy is screaming and crying. They wouldn't let her comfort him, and they drove away, and she could see his little neck craning to get one last glimpse of her. Another father told us about a 7-year-old boy they were going to take, and he just asked, can I just have 1 minute to brace him for what's going to happen? They didn't give him that 1 minute he's holding onto his father's leg as they're pulling him away. And so when we were able to get those stories out, you saw an enormous pushback from the public, and not just in the US, but internationally. So the Pope coming out, even conservative religious leaders, and it made a huge difference, I think, in court, and ultimately the administration decided they weren't going to appeal our ruling and that they were going to try and moderate what they're doing. Ultimately, we got an injunction that said they couldn't do it. And, unfortunately, we are still looking for some of those children all over the world. And the Trump administration is making it very, very difficult. So that's still going on. But I think the larger point is that public reaction did have an effect on the Trump administration. And when Trump was elected the second time, everyone said to me, and, particularly the media, well, this time is going to be different. The public overwhelmingly voted for, harsher immigration, mass deportations, and so you're not really going to be able to do much. And what I said then was, I think it's going to depend on how this plays out in practice, because what I think the American public voted for, to the extent they voted for mass deportations or harsher immigration, was sort of an abstraction, a vague abstraction. They didn't really understand what that meant. And I said, when they see what it looks like in practice, I think you're going to see a reaction. Because the administration had been claiming, well, we're just going to go after the worst of the worst. Obviously, that's not true, right? They're not just going after people with serious criminal convictions. They're going after families, little children. They're pulling them out of their houses in the middle of the night, families who have no criminal convictions, who have been here a long time. And you see the public reaction. You see them pushing back. And I get call after call from people who say, well, wait, Lee, they're taking away the custodian of my son's school. He's the nicest guy. I didn't think that's what they meant by mass deportation. Yeah, that's what they meant. This is what it looks like in practice. They're not just going to go after the worst of the worst. They have a quota, and they're going to, if they're going to try and meet this quota, and that means this going after everyone. You saw it in Minnesota, where they're just going up to people without a warrant, without reasonable suspicion, saying, let me see your papers. And so you have seen that public pushback. I think Minnesota was the first time it really, really started in earnest, but I think you're going to see it continue. And it's because people could see it for their own eyes, could see the human dimension of it. So that's one thing that we need to continue doing, is getting these stories out there, getting the human dimension of it out there, so people can really understand in a concrete way what do these policies mean, so they can say, wait, you're not going after the worst of the worst. I saw the people you're going after. Those aren't the worst of the worst. And this is not what we voted for. So that is an enormous aspect. As much work as we do in the courts, we need to generate that kind of public pushback. Let me just end with sort of a few thoughts, mainly directed at the students, if I could. One is, try not to get overwhelmed. And I know that's easier said than done. But what I hear a lot of people saying is, well, these problems are so big, what can I do? They can't really be changed. Do anything. No matter how small, it really matters. Anything from being nice to some immigrant family you see in trouble, to if you're able to help them in some sort of more formal way, great. If it's tutoring a child, anything, or it's just getting in the street for a march or signing some petition, do any little thing. Everything matters. There's going to be no silver bullet where boom, everything ends. It's a grind. Social justice work is a grind, and it's just, you need to just every day grind at it and do any little thing. If everyone's doing something small, it really matters, and it'll obviously feel good to you. And and a lot of you may be the people who are vulnerable now, and obviously, you need to take care of yourself. And if you're not vulnerable, or you feel like you can help, then just do one small thing. But don't feel like because the problems are so big that you can't make a dent in it, so it's not worth doing anything. The second thing I sort of want to say is that for those of you who are thinking about a legal career, I encourage it. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of jokes about lawyers, or lawyers can't do everything. but lawyers can do some things, and lawyers have more power than you think. And I just want to end with this one story that goes back to the beginning of my legal career at the ACLU. It was probably my first case, and I was, in my 20s, and went down to Texas to talk with a young woman from El Salvador, who was maybe 20 years old, who had signed some forms only in English and had signed away all her rights and was going to be deported back to danger in El Salvador. And it turned out that thousands and thousands of people were signing these forms. And I met with first a grassroots organizer who was the same age as me, late 20s or whatever, and she was the liaison to this woman. And so we went and met with her, and this grassroots organizer, her Spanish was a lot better than mine, so she did the talking. And she started by saying to this Salvadoran woman, Leah's here from New York. He's a muy importante abogado, right? Very important lawyer. And afterward, I said to her, just sort of very cavalierly and glibly and unthinkingly, you should have said I was a muy, muy, muy importante abogado. And she just politely smiled, thanked me for coming. But a few weeks later, I started thinking about the interaction and realized how much wiser this grassroots organizer was than I was, even though we were the same age. What she understood, but I didn't understand at that moment, is this Salvadoran woman felt so vulnerable and needed to hear that someone was on her side, not just anybody, but someone from the establishment. And in fact, a lawyer was on her side, and that was essential for her to hear. And it's something that some of us don't think about because we don't have the same kind of vulnerable relationship to the government. And she understood that the first thing she needed to say to this young woman was there was someone on her side, and it was a lawyer. And I've never forgot that, because you can forget how important it is to be a lawyer for these people. And as Professor Law said, there's no right to government lawyers for immigration. Unlike, with criminal cases, you get a public defender at government expense. And so there's just so many people who don't have lawyers. And when they get a lawyer, they are so thankful to have someone on their side. And it makes an enormous difference. And so for those of you who are thinking, well, do I want to be a lawyer or not? Does it really matter? Do people, I think give it some real thought. I'm always happy to talk to people, but I want to, not limit it to being a lawyer. Obviously, there are so many professions in which you can help, and we have been using medical professionals to help us work with the children. There's just every journalist, so there's just obviously an enormous number of professions, but I think the larger point is just how much people who are that vulnerable need the help of people in what they consider in the establishment. So let me end with that, and hopefully we can have a little bit of Q&A.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for a very sobering and thought-provoking lecture. I think that you're a brilliant storyteller. I think we're all engrossed.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have questions. We open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much for your empowering discussion of these very difficult issues. I too was one of those folks who worked on community organizing, and a lawyer from the NLRB showed up. And the impact it had on people, that she was listening to them in the middle of a strike, was enormous. So, I'm a lawyer, please go to law school. I know it's not everybody's thing to fight this hard, but please consider it, and there's lots of pathways. So, my question to you is, when you're talking about the challenges of making rule of law issues, cognizant to everyday Americans. I'm wondering, in terms of the midterms and a political strategy to help us get out of this, to what extent do you think that what's driving Trump is what somebody called a complexion correction for the country? So what does that mean about strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm taking it by what you mean, how much is driven by hostility toward non-whites, right? And I think it's hard, I mean, throughout history, it's hard to separate out immigration policy from racist impulses. We've seen it throughout our history, starting, with Chinese in the 1800s. And, Professor Law is an expert on that. He has talked openly about which countries he thinks don't deserve to be here, which countries he does, and you can see which countries they are. And he's talked about Scandinavian countries being able to be, should be allowed to be here. I think the strategic question for us has always been, how much do we make that central to what we're arguing? Do the courts want to say the President of the United States is acting in a racist manner with racist intent and declare a policy unlawful on that ground? Or would they prefer, if you give them another way to do it because it is very explosive, right, for a court to say the President of the United States is acting in a racist manner. Now, we have seen some courts say that some policies can only be explained by racist impulses. But ultimately, I think that's always a judgment call for advocates, is how much do you make that front and center in court versus politically. And even politically, right, I'm not, someone who deals strictly in the politics of it, but how much does that play with a wider audience, or how much are you, but to say that immigration policy, that racism has nothing to do with immigration policy would be to be blind to the situation, I think. So I think you're right to raise that question. And I think it's very tricky strategically. And people are always going back and forth about how much to make the race issue central to these issues.
Thank you. Hello, it's me, Bonnie. Now, I have a question for you. Given the fact I'm from a very Trump-heavy neighborhood, and I really don't like being there because of my... have you seen what my parents even voted for Trump? I'm just saying, well, the thing is, you said about the public backlash, unfortunately, it's, well, for some, what do you have to say to the community who were pro-Trump, that the ICE backlash is very top-notch?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's always going to be a segment of the population that is going to back almost anything that ICE does and that the president does on immigration. But I think it's wrong to assume that just because someone voted for Trump or voted in some sort of abstract way for more immigration enforcement, that they're going to be on board with everything that's going on now. And so I think that's where we need to not give up and make it clear to people, look, going after the worst of the worst, going after hardened criminals is one thing, but going after little children, going after families who have committed no crimes is a whole other thing. And I think that we're seeing now more than half the country, maybe way more than half the country, sort of pushing back on this idea that anything goes. Because ultimately, the kind of policies that the Trump administration is enacting require you to desensitize the immigrant community, to not think of them as fully human beings. And so, but I think most of the public, we saw that with family separation, we saw it in Minnesota, will not go there. Believes in a basic fairness and things that are not so inhumane. And so I think that's where, we're going to have to keep pushing.
Thanks so much for your talk. I have a resource question. So the ACLU they have resources. It's not an endless supply of resources. The entire immigration system is under attack, not just undocumented people and asylum seekers. How does your organization prioritize or triage which legal issues to take on and which to maybe hand it off to another civil rights organization?
Yeah, very important question. I would like to say that we have a foolproof scientific method of figuring out how to use our resources, but that's not true. And I would say that probably the most important decisions we make each week are where to use our resources. Because each time we think, okay, well, this is as bad as it can get, so let's pour all our resources into fighting this policy. The next week there's another policy that's even worse. And once you start fighting one policy, you can't just abandon it, and it could take years fighting that. And the ACLU National Office only has 15 lawyers dedicated to immigration. So while we have more resources than most civil rights organizations, we obviously don't have the kind of resources the federal government has. So we try and figure out what can the ACLU do better perhaps than other organizations. So that's maybe what we ought to focus on. And if there's other organizations that can do something equally well or better, maybe they should focus on it. And so, where are we going to get the most bang for the buck? Where is it going to be the most systemic change? How many people is it going to help? But at the end of the day, right now, all the organizations combined do not have enough resources, so we're just really drowning. And the law firms, Trump has gone after the law firms, and so we don't have the kind of law firm support we had during Trump 1. So it's just nonstop. And where we use the resources is an absolutely critical decision each time. And there's no perfect answer. We just have to be careful that we don't use up all our resources and then don't have any more going forward. But on the other hand, if there's something that's so big, like the Alien Enemies Act, we just have to pour resources in.
This is more like, I guess, a mental health question, but also like a disconnect question. You mentioned the disconnect between like policy and theory and policy and practice. So I wanted to ask, like, what are ways that you would suggest that we break down policies not only in writing but connected to how we see them being played out? Because a lot of people who have voted for this current administration were essentially like unaware or just weren't as educated on what these policies actually mean in terms of putting them into practice and how they play into our system. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask like the education, or how we can not only educate ourselves but educate others on breaking down policy and understanding where those
Yeah.
pieces fit in our system.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's because I think, not only what it looks like on paper, but what the Trump administration's saying, because they reach a lot of people, right? And the president can always reach more people than we can. I think it starts with documenting what you see on the ground, and so, especially your generation now is good at documenting things with their phone, with anything, getting stuff out through social media. I think that's what needs to happen. People need to understand, and then we need to sort of just flood the zone of, look, Trump said he's going only with the worst of the worst. Keep it local. In my neighborhood, I saw 6 families with no criminal convictions dragged out, or my friend in school was taken out of school and I know she has no criminal convictions. But just to keep documenting the stories and tell the human stories, document something, get it to groups, get it to a church who can then amplify it even more. But I think that is absolutely critical, that we try and document as much as possible. You know, one of the things that happened in family separation is ProPublica, you know, a media organization, was able to get a tape of the children who had been taken away, and there were a bunch of 3-year-olds who were just crying and crying, and what you heard in the background are the guards laughing at them, you know, even though these are little 3-year-olds who had been taken from their parents, and it really resonated. It got enormous traction, not only just from progressives or Democrats. You know, you saw everyone say, well, wait, this is not something that should happen in the United States. And so, you know, that was a sort of visceral reaction. So that's the kind of thing where I think you're absolutely right. You need to document and show people, but it's all the kind of ways that, you know, comms people do that. You know, you can reach out to the ACLU, but I think it's as simple as getting stories out there of what's really happening. And if everyone did it just in their neighborhood, you would see a huge advance. I don't think people need to feel like they need to break the national story. Just document what they're seeing in their neighborhoods. Are someone calling on people, or? Okay.
Oh, the mic. Sorry, guys. Hi. My name is Ari. Thank you again for being here today and for your presence. My question is more so about the legal battles that we are currently facing. We've seen a lot of due process being used within the 14th Amendment. However, something that I've noticed is the detention centers. To me, they stand out as slaveholders. And I think that's something that has been widely interpreted throughout social media, throughout conversations. And so the 13th Amendment states that the existence of slavery and voluntary servitude shall not exist within the United States, except that you have been duly convicted. What we are witnessing is not is voting process of these individuals. How can we see the application of the 13th Amendment being utilized by the ACLU and other organizations to kind of combat the detention centers?
Yeah, so I think there have been cases brought about forcing immigrant detainees to work, like for $1 a day kind of thing. And so those cases have had some success. But to your larger point of whether the courts would be willing to say immigration detention is slavery, I don't, you know, I'm just giving you my realistic view. I don't think that we're ever going to see that. And one of the things the courts say is the difference between criminal detention, you know, imprisonment, and immigration detention is that an immigrant can always choose to leave, that they have the keys to the door, because if they want to go home, they can go home. And obviously that's a false, harsh choice, because a lot of people can't go home and they want to finish their cases. But I think that's ultimately what the courts have, you know, that's what the courts have said, and I think ultimately it probably will never be a winning argument that immigration detention constitutes slavery. Now, that doesn't mean that conditions in detention centers, which are horrendous, can't be challenged, but sort of a per se immigration detention is unlawful, no matter how good the conditions may be, is probably not something, just being realistic, that we're ever going to win on 13th Amendment grounds.
Sorry. I had a two-parter, sorry. I, for one, wanted to know if there will be consequences, including immediate disbarment for the government lawyers that pretended to not know what was going on
Right.
with the Venezuelan immigrants, and what those consequences could be outside of the disbarment. And secondly, I wanted to know if you saw the, well, if you felt how ironic it was that the president that's spearheading this is married to an immigrant and is carrying this out as if he is not, you know, connected to someone.
Yeah. So I will leave it to all you to think about that second question and the irony of that second question. Yeah. So on the first one, it's a very good question. So there is something called disbarment. If you're a lawyer, you can be disbarred, meaning you can't be a lawyer again ever, or you might not be able to be a lawyer for a certain period of time or in a particular court. I think that we may ultimately see some of the government lawyers referred to the disciplinary committees for that kind of proceeding. In terms of greater penalties, what our judge is trying to do is refer them for actual criminal prosecution. And the Trump administration is, needless to say, resisting letting any of the facts come out. They've appealed it. We're waiting for an appeals decision. I think if we ultimately win and the appeals court says the government lawyers have to take the stand, they may go to the U.S. Supreme Court to try and stop it, because they know that if these lawyers have to take the stand, they're in real trouble because they deliberately violated the order. So at one end of the spectrum is potential criminal penalties. The other end is they get off. You know, maybe there'll be disbarments, which is not insignificant, but it's not. So we'll have to see. There could be civil sanctions, but I think it's all going to play out, and it's going to be very telling. But you're right to ask about the different types of penalties, because there are different ways to get at it. But this judge feels like what they did is criminal.
Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's truly a reality check. You know, definitely to know what people are experiencing on every level. But I also want to stress that I think for students here and everywhere, that we want to give them a sense of hope.
Right.
How can you be impactful? Like they really need to understand that, because it's not give up now, it's how do you fight back? And so I think giving them more and more of those type of, ideas of how to be more impactful and making change on all levels by what we do.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you want to understand the reality of how bad things are so you get galvanized, but you don't want to feel like it's hopeless, and so doing nothing, whatever you do will be meaningless. I am one of those people who feels like things can change. I could not be doing this work for 33 years if I didn't think that, and I think even if you just look at the past year where everyone said, oh, Trump can do whatever he wants on immigration, to what we've seen recently with all the pushback in Minnesota and other places, you see that the public can change things. And, I think some of you could go look at the ACLU's website. We have something called People Power that has lots of ways to get involved. I think there's, obviously in Brooklyn there are lots of community groups, nonprofits who are doing this work, and they can give you lots of different ways. And then there's just sort of signing petitions, pushing out stories on social media, joining marches. But look to your, in the ACLU can give you different organizations, but look to local organizations to get involved. That's the best way, sort of on the ground. But I certainly don't want to suggest to you, as bad as things are, that they can't change, because they have changed and they will change. But it is, as I said, it's a grind, and it takes real work and rolling up your sleeves. There's no magic bullet, and it's not going to be like you join one march and then everything's going to change, right? It's just a slow, gradual grinding of it. So do not give up hope, and the only way things are going to change is people pushing back, and especially your generation.
Hi, hello. I want to sort of speak.
Oh, sorry.
I want to sort of speak a little bit more on what you said towards the end of making the point as a community to sort of speak out. I am secretary of the Brooklyn College Dream Team, and my club is set out to create a safe space for undocumented immigrant students. So my question is in the past you have worked with other clubs with similar goals as ours and organizations to spread information. So my question is two. Firstly, what do you believe is the importance of student clubs to sort of speak out in these sort of moments? How to spread information, like important resources. And second, would your firm organization ever consider pairing up with clubs, to also help spread information, not only to other, let's say, professors or staff?
Well, definitely what you're doing sounds very, very important. And I think any pushback, especially organized at the student level, is fantastic. I think that's something we could talk about after, not in the sort of big group, but I think where you would probably try and pair up is with our New York Civil Liberties Union, and they do have those kinds of collaboration. So I think you want to reach out to them, okay? It's called NYCLU, and they're the people who would, I think, work with you at a local level.
Okay, there's actually room for one more question, but I know there are two hands.
Maybe they can both ask the question.
Yeah, so we'll do that, okay? So one here and one over there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was very enlightening. I did have a question. You said that the Alien Enemies Act is primarily a wartime piece of legislation. Does the ACLU foresee any attempt to broaden immigrant deportations with the rising conflict in Iran and then Venezuela as well? And are you guys like organizing a plan to combat that?
Got the final question.
I wanted to first of all thank you for the work that you do as a personal and I also wanted to ask about, you mentioned grassroots organizing. Talk a little bit about student clubs, and that seems really interesting. How have you seen grassroots, there's like huge infrastructure, grassroots organizing, interactive, huge infrastructure, people advocacy, beyond like the simple act of like translation?
So how have I seen them work together? Yeah. So, I mean, to your question, you know, the ACLU is organizing a lot over what's recently happened in Iran, you know, at the level of should Congress have been consulted, obviously, you know, that kind of thing. Whether there'll be more removals in the immediate future because of this, I don't know. You know, I think it's hard. Unbelievably, we have been deporting people to Iran recently. Could we actually deport people to Iran now? I don't know. That seems hard to believe in for this administration. But I think ultimately we may see some of that happen. So I think we will be monitoring it. The Venezuela situation is also very delicate. We're starting to send people to Venezuela. But you're right to ask about that. All these types of international situations result in tricky situations. So we'll be monitoring. As to your question, I think one of the places where the coordination works extremely well is the grassroots groups get the stories out and know about the stories best, but also, like, we rely on the grassroots groups to tell us what's happening on the ground, right? We don't want to just sue, you know, to your question about what's on paper. Well, what's actually happening on the ground? And sometimes the administration won't actually put things on paper. They'll do it in secret. So we rely on the grassroots organizations to say, this is what's happening, you got to get involved. And then even to the level of getting us individuals to serve as the plaintiffs in the case. So that coordination between the grassroots groups and the legal organizations is absolutely essential, because we can't know everything that's going on the ground, especially if the administration is trying to keep it secret.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At the Wolf Institute, we like to say that we build community by learning together. And I want to invite you to a couple weeks. We have Test Week with Russell M. Young, the founder of the Stop AIP Hate campaign, and a professor at San Francisco State University. And we're going to continue on the conversations that we'll be having today. So please join us for that. I want to thank the San Jose Konefsky family. I want to thank Professor Law, Professor Ratchinson. I want to congratulate my former student colleague. Congratulations. And above all, I really want to thank Lee for making it to campus. Lee was supposed to be here last year as part of Melissa Mary's residency during Test Week, but you had to go off the court to save people's lives, which is far more important. So we're glad we finally were able to get you to Brooklyn College. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.
And your smarts and your example with us. Thank you very much.